My brother smiled when the will was read. He got the lake house, the dock, the boats, the view my father loved. I got the garage, a detached concrete box behind the old property, filled with dust and oil stains. Everyone said it was fair. He had kids, I didn't. He needed space. I didn't argue. But when I stepped inside that garage for the first time and saw the old steel safe bolted into the back wall, I realized my father had never been careless. He had been deliberate. And my brother had no idea what he'd left behind. Stay with me, because what was inside that safe didn't just change the inheritance. It changed what I thought I knew about my father, about my brother, and about the story we'd both been telling ourselves for years. The garage smelled like gasoline and cold concrete. My brother, Darren, had already driven back to the lake house by the time I unlocked it. He'd been eager, too eager, talking about dock repairs and summer rentals before the funeral flowers had even wilted. I stood alone in the narrow space, staring at shelves lined with rustic tools, my father's tools, wrenches organized by size, screwdrivers in neat rows. He'd been a careful man, not sentimental, careful. The safe sat behind a stack of old paint cans, half hidden, dark gray, industrial, bolted low into the wall near the floor. I crouched in front of it. I remembered it from when I was 12. I'd once asked him what was inside. "Things that matter," he'd said. No smile, just steady eye contact. I had assumed documents, insurance, maybe some cash. Now my knees pressed against cold concrete as I wiped dust from the dial. There was no combination written anywhere, no note in the will about it, just silence. The lawyer had read the document plainly. Darren, primary residence, lake house, boat, contents. That was the language. Its contents. At the time, I felt the sting. Darren tried to hide his relief, but I saw it in the way his shoulders loosened. I told myself I didn't care. I'd moved out of state years ago. I had my own career in Phoenix. I didn't need a vacation house. But standing in that garage, something unsettled me. Why separate the garage from the house? Why specify it? I ran my fingers over the dial. I knew my father. He was practical, structured. He didn't do symbolic gestures, unless he was teaching something. I searched the drawers along the workbench. Nothing but screws, nails, spare keys to cars that no longer existed. I almost laughed at myself. Maybe this was just a safe. Maybe I was turning it into something bigger because losing him felt too simple otherwise. My phone buzzed. Darren. "You get in?" he asked. "Yeah." "Anything good in there?" His tone was light, casual. "Mostly tools." He paused. Not long, just enough. "There's nothing else back there, right?" I looked at the safe. "Like what?" "Like Dad used to keep paperwork in weird places, just making sure there's nothing important that should really be with the house." Should really be with the house. The phrasing stuck. "I'll let you know," I said. Another pause. His breathing shifted slightly. "Okay, just don't start imagining stuff, Luke. Dad kept things simple." Imagining stuff. I ended the call and stared at the steel door again. Simple. That was Darren's version of our father. Mine was different. When I was 16, Dad had once made me rebuild a carburetor 3 times because I skipped one step. "Details decide outcomes," he'd said quietly. Details decide outcomes. I stood and looked around the garage more carefully. There was a framed photo above the workbench, Dad and Darren at the lake. Darren holding a fish, Dad smiling. No photos of me. That wasn't new. Darren stayed local, worked construction, married young. Dad admired that. I left for college, then law school. Different city,
different rhythm. For years, I thought Dad saw that as distance. Maybe he did. I crouched again and leaned closer to the safe. The paint was scratched around the dial, used but not often. I pressed my ear to the cold metal and turned it slowly. Click. I froze. That wasn't imagination. I tried again, slow, careful. Click. The tumblers were moving. My pulse shifted, not racing, just focused. This wasn't random. I thought about dates. Dad's birthday, Darren's birthday, mine. None felt right. Then I remembered something else. He had always used the same number when setting workshop locks, a sequence tied to the year he bought the land. He told me once while Darren was outside. Consistency matters, he'd said. I turned the dial to that number. Nothing. I exhaled slowly. Maybe Darren was right. Maybe I was building meaning into scrap metal. I leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling beams. The will had been updated 6 months ago, after Dad's heart scare. Darren had driven him to the hospital that night. I had flown in 2 days later. That thought lingered longer than I expected. I looked at the safe again, and for the first time, a small doubt crept in. What if the garage wasn't a gift? What if the safe held something Darren didn't want near the lake house? I stood slowly. I walked to the breaker panel and flipped the lights brighter. The garage hummed softly. Back at the safe, I noticed something I had missed. The bolts weren't original. The safe had been reinforced into the wall recently. The surrounding concrete was newer, slightly different shade. 6 months wasn't long enough for that much difference. My chest tightened. I ran my fingers along the bottom edge. There were scratch marks on the floor, faint, like it had been moved before being secured again. Why move a safe inside a garage? Unless it hadn't always been here. Unless it had been somewhere else first. The house. I sat back on the cold concrete floor and stared at the metal door. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something sharper than grief. Not anger. Not yet. Suspicion. And it wasn't loud. It was quiet, controlled, like my father had always been. I reached for the dial again. Slower this time. More patient. If this was nothing, I would accept that. But if it was, then the inheritance wasn't about property. It was about narrative. And I wasn't sure my brother had told me the full story. The dial clicked again beneath my fingers.
The third click was softer than the others. I almost missed it. My hand stayed on the dial. I didn't rush. Dad hated rushing. If you hurry, you miss what matters, he used to say. I turned the handle. It didn't open. I leaned back, exhaled slowly, then tried again. This time I pulled instead of pushing. The door shifted, just slightly. My chest tightened. I didn't feel excitement. I felt something steadier, like a piece of machinery finally aligning. The safe opened with a low metal sigh. Inside, there weren't stacks of cash or gold bars, nothing dramatic, just 3 things: a thick manila envelope, a small black external hard drive, and a leather notebook I recognized instantly. Dad's handwriting lived in that notebook. He carried it everywhere during the last few years: grocery lists, property tax notes, random observations. I reached for the envelope first. It was labeled in block letters, Lucas. Not Son's, not both our names, just mine. I sat on the floor and opened it carefully. Inside were copies of property documents, the lake house deed, the garage parcel, a separate document I didn't recognize at first. Then I saw the header, Transfer of Ownership, Conditional. My throat went dry. It referenced the lake house, but not in the way I expected.
It stated that the lake house had been transferred into Darren's name 3 months before the will was signed. 3 months. Before the official reading. I blinked and read it again. Dad had already given Darren the house, which meant the will hadn't been distributing it. It simply acknowledged what was already done. My breathing shifted. Why keep that quiet? Why let the reading play out as if it were a fresh decision? I flipped to the next page. There was a clause. If Lucas chooses to execute the enclosed authorization, the lake property shall revert under specified conditions. My hand went still. Revert under specified conditions. I searched the envelope again. There was a second folded sheet. Authorization of review. It granted me the right to initiate a financial audit of the lake property's renovation expenses over the past year. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. This wasn't emotional. This was procedural. Dad hadn't written letters about love or regret. He had created a mechanism. I set the papers down and picked up the leather notebook. The last entries were dated 2 weeks before he died. Short, precise. Darren says upgrades cost more than expected. Receipts unclear. Lucas must see clearly. That last line made my jaw tighten. Must see clearly. I leaned back against the garage wall. For years, Darren handled the lake house. Dad trusted him with repairs, rental agreements, dock maintenance. I was the outsider, the one who visited twice a year and asked questions that sounded like criticism. But this wasn't about favoritism. This was about accountability. My phone buzzed again. Darren. I let it ring once before answering. "Hey," he said. His tone was relaxed. Too relaxed. "You moved the safe." Silence. Then a short laugh. "What safe?" "In the garage. It wasn't always there." Another pause. "You're overthinking it, Luke. Dad had stuff moved around last year." There it was. Overthinking. He'd used that word before, when I asked about the dock repairs that seemed overpriced, when I questioned why rental income had dipped. "You transferred the lake house before the will," I said calmly. The line went very quiet. "Dad wanted to simplify things," he replied finally. "Less probate, cleaner." "Then why didn't the lawyer mention it?" "That's not how this works. Don't start building some conspiracy." Conspiracy. My eyes dropped to the notebook again. Receipts unclear. "Did Dad ever ask to see renovation invoices?" I asked calmly. A breath on the other end. "He trusted me." "That's not what I asked." The silence this time stretched longer. I could picture him standing in the kitchen of the lake house, hand on the counter, jaw tight. "You're not an accountant," he said. "You're a lawyer. You like paperwork. That doesn't mean something's wrong." I noticed the shift. He wasn't denying anything. He was reframing it. I felt something small and uncomfortable rise inside me. Doubt. What if I was doing it again, turning ambiguity into accusation? Dad was sick. Darren carried more responsibility. Maybe the transfer was practical. Maybe the audit authorization was just precaution. Maybe I was about to damage what little was left between us over numbers. "I'm not accusing you," I said carefully. "I just want transparency." "You don't trust me." "That's not the same thing. It feels like it." His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. For a moment, I saw it from his side. Years of managing the property, handling Dad's appointments, watching me fly in for brief visits and then leave. Maybe this wasn't manipulation. Maybe it was resentment. "I haven't filed anything," I said carefully. "I'm just reading." Another long breath from him. "You always did that," he said quietly. "Did what?" "Stood back, watched, like you were waiting for something to prove your point." The comment landed harder than I expected, because part of me knew it wasn't entirely wrong. I had always kept emotional distance. It was easier to observe than engage. I looked at the hard drive still sitting inside the safe. "You knew about this, didn't you?" I asked. "Knew about what?" "The review clause." This time, his silence felt different. Not defensive, guarded. "I told Dad if he didn't trust me," Darren said slowly, "he should make it official." The words settled into place. If he didn't trust me. That wasn't what the notebook said. It said receipts unclear. Must see clearly. "You pushed for this," I said. "You pushed for clarity," he replied. "Same thing you're pretending to want now." The garage felt smaller suddenly. The narrative I'd built of Darren quietly shifting assets tilted slightly. What if this wasn't about hiding something? What if it was about proving something? I closed my eyes briefly. The safe wasn't a trap. It was a test. But I still didn't know who it was testing. Me or him? I picked up the hard drive and turned it over in my hand. "You don't need to dig," Darren said softly. "The house is yours to use any time. We're still brothers." The statement sounded generous, but something in it felt like a boundary. I stared at the steel door of the open safe. Details decide outcomes, and I still didn't know which detail mattered most.
I didn't answer Darren right away. The garage was quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead light. I looked at the hard drive in my hand. It was heavier than it should have been. "I'm not digging," I said finally. "I'm understanding." There was a difference. He exhaled through his nose. Not angry, not relieved either. "Just don't make this into something it's not," he said. "Dad was sick. He didn't want drama. Neither do I. That's not always how it ends with you." The comment stayed with me after we hung up. Not always how it ends with you. I used to think I was the calm one, the rational one. Darren was emotional, reactive, protective. But maybe I just processed things slower. Maybe I let tension sit longer. I plugged the hard drive into my laptop on the workbench. The garage Wi-Fi barely reached, so I used my phone's hotspot. The drive opened immediately. One folder. Lake Financials. No password. That surprised me. Inside were subfolders organized by month, renovation estimates, contractor invoices, bank transfer confirmations. At first glance, everything looked clean. Too clean. Every document scanned neatly, every invoice formatted professionally. No scribbled receipts, no irregular handwriting. I clicked into one of the larger invoices. Dock reconstruction, $48,200. The contractor listed was a company I didn't recognize. I searched the name online. Small local LLC, registered 8 months ago. Owner, Darren Cole. My stomach tightened. It wasn't hidden. It was right there in public records. He had formed a company, then billed the lake property for work done under that company's name. That wasn't automatically wrong, if he did the work, if it was legitimate. But the invoice described subcontracted labor. I opened the bank transfer confirmation. The funds had moved from Dad's account into Darren's LLC account. My breathing shifted, slower. I checked another invoice. Kitchen remodeling, $27,000. Same pattern, different month, same LLC. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen. This wasn't sloppy theft. It was structured, clean, documented. I felt that same uncomfortable doubt rise again. What if Dad knew? What if he approved this? Maybe Darren formalized his labor into a company to streamline payments. Maybe the margins were fair. I pulled up the notebook and flipped to another page. Darren Incorporated. The note was dated 7 months ago. Under it, a single line: ask about margins. No accusation, no anger, just that: ask about margins. I closed my eyes briefly. Dad wasn't dramatic. If he suspected theft, he would have written it plainly. Instead, he wrote questions, which meant he hadn't finished answering them. My phone buzzed again. Another text this time. From Darren. "You find anything?" I stared at the screen. My instinct was to confront him immediately, but something stopped me. If I went at him directly, he'd defend, rationalize, escalate. If I stayed quiet, he might reveal more. I typed back, still reviewing. 3 dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, okay. That was it. No pressure, no demand, just okay. I minimized the invoices and opened the final folder on the drive. Audio. There was only one file, recorded 2 months ago. My chest tightened. I hesitated before pressing play. Dad's voice filled the garage, weak, slower than I remembered, but steady. "Lucas," he said, "if you're hearing this, it means you opened the safe." I swallowed. I didn't want to accuse Darren without clarity. He believes what he's doing is justified. My grip tightened around the laptop edge. He says he's compensating himself for years of unpaid labor. He may not be entirely wrong. There was a cough, paper rustling. "If you review this, do it without anger and without assumption." My eyes burned slightly. "I didn't separate the garage to punish either of you," he continued. "I separated it to remove noise." Noise. He and I see responsibility differently. I need you to see facts, not defend him, not attack him, just see clearly. The audio paused for several seconds. I could hear his breathing. "Whatever you choose after that, let it be calm." The audio ended. The garage felt heavier. This wasn't a trap. It wasn't an exposure. It was mediation from beyond the conflict. Dad knew. He just didn't resolve it himself. He passed the decision to me. I stared at the invoices again. Compensating for unpaid labor. Was that theft? Or was it a son who felt owed? I remembered the years Darren spent fixing the dock while I built a career elsewhere. The nights he drove Dad to appointments. The resentment in his voice earlier. "You don't trust me." Maybe this wasn't about money at all. Maybe it was about recognition. Still, forming an LLC and billing without explicit approval crossed a line, even if the work was real. I checked the total transfers across all months. It added up to just under $180,000. Not millions, but not small either. I looked at the lake house through the garage window in the distance. Darren probably thought he'd already proven himself, that the transfer before the will was Dad's vote of confidence. But Dad had left the audit authorization for a reason, not to punish, to clarify. And now the question wasn't whether Darren had taken money. He had. The question was whether it was justified, and whether I was willing to test that answer. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Darren. "You're quiet." I stared at the screen, then typed, "We need to talk in person." This time, the dots stayed longer. Finally, "When?" I looked at the safe still open on the floor. "Tomorrow," I wrote, because whatever happened next, it couldn't stay inside a garage.
I drove to the lake house the next morning. The water was still, gray, quiet. The dock looked solid, fresh boards, clean lines. If Darren had done the work himself, it showed. He was standing on the porch when I pulled up, coffee in hand, arms crossed, but not aggressive, just guarded. We didn't hug. We hadn't in years. Inside, the house smelled faintly of varnish and lemon cleaner, renovated kitchen, new cabinets, stone countertops. Money had been spent. He sat at the dining table. I stayed standing for a moment, then sat across from him. Neither of us spoke first. Silence sat between us. Not explosive, just heavy. "You found it," he said. "The hard drive, the audio." His jaw tightened slightly. "He left that for you, didn't he?" "Yes." He nodded once, slow. I figured. That surprised me. "You knew?" I asked. I knew he was recording things toward the end. I didn't know what he said. He took a sip of coffee, but didn't break eye contact. "What do you think?" he asked. It wasn't defensive, it was direct. "I think you incorporated an LLC and billed the property," I said calmly, "without a written agreement." "I did the work." "That's not the question." "It should be." His voice rose slightly, then settled. "I spent 10 years maintaining this place, replacing beams, handling renters. Dad never paid me, not really, just small transfers. I tracked everything." "Then why not formalize it openly?" I asked. Because he would have said no. There it was, honest, not polished. He didn't think labor between families should be invoiced. He thought helping was helping. "And you disagreed?" "Yes." His eyes didn't move. "That's the conflict," he said. "Not theft, not fraud, just disagreement." I studied his posture. No fidgeting, no darting eyes. He believed what he was saying. "But you still transferred money," I said quietly. "Yes." "And didn't tell him clearly how much." He hesitated just slightly. He knew I was incorporating. He knew costs were going up. That's not the same as disclosure. He leaned back in his chair. "You've always needed paperwork to feel safe. That's not fair. It's true." His words didn't sting as much as I expected, maybe because part of me agreed. "I'm not trying to corner you," I said. "I'm trying to understand." He looked down at the table for the first time. "I felt invisible," he said. The admission landed heavier than any accusation. "Dad praised you, your degrees, your cases, your logic. I fixed things, quietly. No one applauds that." I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about $180,000. It was about value. "You think he didn't see you?" I asked. "I think he saw what I did. I don't think he respected it." Silence followed, longer this time. I watched his hands, steady, not clenched. "I could have talked to him," I said. "He didn't talk. He issued expectations." That was true. Dad wasn't emotional. He issued expectations. I asked for margins once. He just stared at me like I'd broken some rule. Margins. The notebook entry. "He wrote that down," I said. Darren's face flicked up. "What?" "He wrote, 'Ask about margins.'" Darren went still. "He never told me that." "He didn't tell me either. He just recorded that audio." I watched his face process it. Not anger, not fear, something closer to regret. "He didn't accuse you," I added. "He said you believed you were justified." Darren swallowed. "That sounds like him." The air between us felt different now, less charged, more exposed. "I haven't filed the audit authorization," I said. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "But I can. I know. And if I do, it won't be to punish you." "What will it be?" "To close the question." He looked out the window toward the water. "You think I stole from him. I think you took money without clear agreement. That's a legal answer. It's the accurate one." He exhaled. "I don't regret paying myself. I regret not forcing the conversation sooner." That wasn't what I expected. I thought he'd defend every cent. Instead, he was admitting timing. If the audit shows margins were excessive, what then? He didn't hesitate. "Then I'll reimburse the difference." Calm, firm. "And if they weren't? Then you accept that I wasn't exploiting him." That's fair. Too fair, which made it harder. Because now this wasn't about catching him. It was about deciding if clarity was worth reopening wounds. "I don't want to be your enemy," he said quietly. "I don't want that either." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was fragile. "I'm not Dad," I said. "I know. I don't need to win this." He studied my face. "Then what do you need?" I thought about that carefully. "I need to stop wondering." That was the truth. He nodded slowly. "Then file it," he said. The answer surprised me. "You're sure?" "Yes." His voice didn't shake. "If I was wrong, I'll face it. If I wasn't, you will." There was no hostility in the words, just resolute. For the first time since opening the safe, I felt something settle. Not victory, not defeat, just direction. Dad had removed the noise. Now we had to remove the doubt. I stood up. "I'll start the review this week." Darren stood too. We didn't shake hands, but the air between us wasn't fractured. It was honest. And honesty, even uncomfortable, felt steadier than silence.
The audit took 6 weeks, longer than I expected. I hired an independent firm in Minneapolis, not someone I knew, not someone Darren could claim bias against. I didn't visit the lake house during that time. We spoke only twice, short calls. No tension, no warmth either, just waiting. The firm reviewed contractor estimates in the county, labor rates, material costs, comparable dock renovations, kitchen remodel pricing within a 50-mile radius. They were thorough. I tried not to think about the outcome, but I did. Some nights I imagined finding inflated margins, evidence of quiet exploitation, a clean moral line I could stand behind. Other nights I imagined the opposite, that Darren's numbers were fair, that my suspicion had been projection. Each possibility carried its own weight. When the email finally arrived, I didn't open it immediately. I stared at the subject line for a full minute. Independent Financial Review, Lake Property. I drove to the lake house instead. Darren was already there when I arrived, sitting on the dock this time, not the porch. The water was brighter than the day we argued, early afternoon sun cutting across the surface. He stood when he saw me. "You got it?" he said. "Yes." "Open it." I didn't sit. I didn't stall. I opened the PDF. The first page summarized findings. Renovation costs within regional market average, confirmed. Labor markups 12% above subcontractor rate. Industry standard markup range 10 to 15%. I kept reading. Dock reconstruction pricing, fair. Kitchen remodel, slightly above median but justified by material grade. Total transferred compensation over 12 months, reasonable for documented labor hours. No evidence of fraudulent inflation, no evidence of hidden withdrawals. I read the final line twice. While informal communication appears to have contributed to misunderstanding, financial activity aligns with industry norms. I lowered the tablet slowly. Darren hadn't moved. "Well?" he asked. "You were within standard margins." He didn't smile. He just exhaled.
And there's no evidence of exploitation. He looked out at the water for a moment. I told you. You did. I waited. He turned back toward me. What now? That was the question. The safe held documents. The drive held numbers, but none of it addressed the space between us. You felt invisible, I said quietly. He didn't deny it. I felt unnecessary. His eyebrows shifted slightly. Dad trusted you with the property. He trusted me with the review. That's not the same as approval. No, I agreed. It's not. We stood in silence again. This time, it wasn't fragile. It was reflective. I could have asked for more transparency, he said finally, even if he would have said no. I could have visited more, asked better questions. We both nodded slightly, not as apology, as acknowledgement. The lake house hadn't been a prize. The garage hadn't been a punishment. Dad hadn't divided property. He divided responsibility. Darren handled the physical structure. I handled the structural doubt. Neither role was superior, just different. I'm not filing anything further, I said. Darren's shoulders eased in a way I hadn't seen before. But I want something, I added. He waited. I want written clarity going forward, shared financial logs, not because I don't trust you, because I don't want this again. He considered that, then nodded. That's fair. No defensiveness, no sarcasm, just agreement. We sat down on the dock side by side, not touching, just close enough to feel the quiet. You know, he said after a while, I thought the safe was for cash. I almost smiled. I thought it was a trap. He looked at me sideways. It wasn't. No, it was a filter. Dad knew we'd interpret the inheritance through our own insecurities. He hadn't forced a verdict. He'd forced clarity. I'm glad you filed it. So am I said then. Not because it proved him right, but because it removed the narrative I'd started building, the quiet suspicion, the half-formed resentment, the idea that he had taken something from me. He hadn't. He had just valued his contribution differently than Dad did, and differently than I did. That difference wasn't betrayal. It was perspective. The sun dipped slightly lower over the water. You're keeping the garage? He asked. Yes. He nodded. Good. Dad would have hated anyone else touching those tools. I looked back toward the detached building in the distance. It didn't feel small anymore. It felt precise. I'll restore it. Of course you will. There was no mockery in his voice, just familiarity. For the first time since the will reading, I didn't feel like we were on opposite sides of something. We were just two sons who had processed the same father differently. The safe had never been about money. It had been about whether we could face uncertainty without destroying each other. Dad had left the final move to us, and we hadn't turned it into war. We turned it into understanding. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear.